Hello, everybody. This week we are talking about humans and the environment. In this photo, on this opening slide, this is a picture of Machu Picchu, which is an archaeological site in the highlands of Peru. Um, Without going too much into it, there's a lot of really interesting adaptive mechanisms that you have to do when you live at the top of mountains, particularly ones this steep. And so, as an overview of what we're doing today, we're going to start with this idea from early approaches to anthropological questions of humans and the environment that framed culture as an adaptive mechanism, a way of adapting to diverse environmental contexts. Now, one issue here is it's also important to think about how culture can also be maladaptive. For example, we seem to be doing a pretty good job creating some pretty fucking maladaptive relationships with the environment right now. That really seems to be coming into full force. I mean, look at what happens in downtown Charleston every time there's a storm and the way it floods. And so from there, more contemporary cutting edge forms of anthropological research often critique this idea of human exceptionalism. The idea that humans are somehow exceptional compared to the rest of animals, compared to the rest of the environment, and live outside of the environment, as well as the social construction of what it means to be human, animals, and the social construction of nature. I'm going to talk about indigenous critiques of the Anthropocene, or the idea, and the Anthropocene comes from the word anthropos, same root as anthropology, humans. Scene refers to a geological era, so the Anthropocene is the geological era of human-driven climate change. And it is something that geologically we do see in the strata of the Earth. So the previous geological age was the Holocene. Before that was the Pleistocene. The Pleistocene is the Ice Age. The Holocene is the kind of climate that existed on Earth for the past 10,000 years or so. And then the Anthropocene is the most recent, the current geological age. Now, indigenous critiques of this concept point out that, well, we're not really talking about human-driven climate change. We're talking about the result of particular social, political, and economic systems, particular cultural systems that have these effects, and in which these negative effects are distributed unequally among different populations along the lines of existing social inequalities. So I like to think historically because it's easier to grapple with the older questions first, and from that foundation, the newer questions anthropologists are asking today are going to be a little bit more clear because we can start to see where those questions come from, what the problems with the older questions were, and the new questions are pretty complicated. So this gives us a nicer foundation to start with. So in the 1960s and 70s, there was a major debate within anthropology between two camps. On the one side, you had the symbolic anthropologists. Those are the people who we've talked about in this class already in many ways, right? Who are viewing culture as a system of symbols. And this is very much tied. For example, we see this a lot in the anthropology of religion for last week, because the idea of symbolism is really helpful for getting at those kinds of spiritual beliefs. And on the other side, the other camp is what was called materialist anthropologists. Materialist anthropologists were primarily were primarily interested in culture as an adaptive system. So we've actually talked about this framework too to some extent. So they regarded culture as a set of adaptive mechanisms that allow humans to spread across many different environments in a way that many other animals on planet Earth are not able to do without that kind of basis of learned behavior. And so this was really that core question within this traditional, the older framework was how are human beings adapting to their environments? And this is what was often called cultural ecology, understanding the relationship between culture and ecology. And some of this can get very materialistic, right? There were people who theorized culture essentially in terms of calorie outputs. And so culture was a system of maximizing calorie intake versus expenditure in different environments. Um, Now, since this time period of the 1960s and 1970s, anthropology has really shifted out of those kinds of oppositions. Today, most researchers would just tell you that yes, both are happening. We need to think about the material conditions and we need to think about the symbolic ones, and those aren't actually opposed. And in these photos I have for you, I was just thinking about, oh, what would be a good picture to Google. And as I did it, I started realizing this is taking us a little outside of cultural ecology, but it's so interesting and it's relevant to the next set of topics, so I'm going to go into it anyway. So the first thing I Googled was pastoralists. And when I Googled pastoralists, what I got was primarily African people. And I was like, that's weird. I wonder why pastoralism is being framed in terms of this particular kind of cultural area. And it was starting to hit those billiard ball kinds of and social evolutionist flags for me because I'm like, this is a weird pattern. And so then I Googled hunter gatherer. And what I got there was primarily images of Native American people and drawings of humans hunting mastodons. So indigenous peoples and cavemen, essentially, right? Again, these red flags are going off. And then I Googled foragers, and what was really interesting was when I Googled forager, which is the exact same meaning, it means the exact same thing as hunter-gatherer, I got a bunch of white people, mostly gathering mushrooms and like berries and shit. And, these are like white, like, I don't know, fucking hipsters and shit. And I just thought that was so fascinating how these terms by which we use to even conceptualize humans and their relationships to the environment and different ways of making a living, what I would call subsistence patterns or modes of subsistence, are today racially coded by the non-human algorithms of Google's AI. So I didn't really have a good picture because all of them felt vaguely racist and social evolutionists, so I just put two in here, and here you go. Now, today anthropologists are increasingly interested specifically in the moments when our cultural dichotomies between nature and culture, this idea that humans are somehow different than the rest of the environment, are different than other animals, starts falling apart. Because what we've really seen in the past, 25 years or so, is that this idea that humans are fundamentally separate from the environment is not particularly adaptive. Here we are in this world of increasingly dramatic climate change, and first of all, the assumptions are no longer holding to make sense of the world we live in today. It no longer is helpful to separate humans from the rest of the environment in order to understand these kinds of problems. And, well, shoot, it's just really like as a belief system been tied to some economic processes that are pretty fucking harmful and destructive. So today, anthropologists are increasingly thinking about relationships between humans and animals and different ways of understanding human and non-human relationships. So I have for you an example of this, which is a meme of comments on cute animals video starter pack. It's silly, but it's like a really good kind of just entry point into saying like, oh look, we can actually think about human relationships with non-humans and even ideas about non-human animals as something we can think about anthropologically, as a cultural system. And so today, the frameworks that anthropologists are using are shifting away from this kind of framework of thinking about a culture as an adaptive mechanism to the environment to instead thinking about culture as an adaptive mechanism to both environmental and historical context and thinking about the ways those two things intersect with one another, our environmental context and our historical context. Just the way we've been doing with everything we've read since that billiard ball critique, we're really interested in understanding that historical context and larger social context. So we're also increasingly interested in climate change and environmental catastrophe as a social phenomenon. That includes two kinds of subcategories in my mind. One is are the effects of climate change distributed differently among different communities on the basis of social inequalities. This is what I would call environmental justice or political ecology. The idea that our political and economic systems and our environmental systems are deeply enmeshed. So, for example, look at Hurricane Katrina, to take an older example for y'all, but I remember when that happened in New Orleans. This was the first of the massive hurricanes that started devastating um, the region of the South in ways that, were far more destructive than what had previously happened. And the historical context for that includes things like the draining of the wetlands in Louisiana, which previously had been able to absorb a lot of rising water levels, sea levels, as a result of like hurricanes coming through. And as those wetlands get drained, there's not as much of an environmental cushion. Likewise, one of the effects of climate change on an atmospheric level, it's not so much that everywhere across the Earth is warming, rather the gradient between the coldest parts of the Earth and the hottest parts of the Earth are becoming less and less severe. So the colder parts are getting warmer much quicker than the more equatorial parts of the planet. Now, in terms of hurricanes, the impact of that is they go further because of the particular atmospheric conditions that lead to hurricanes and cause hurricanes to continue. Hurricanes just travel further and stay stronger than they did 25 years ago. And so one of the effects, right, was in New Orleans was that the levee, which had previously held the water back from many parts of that city, broke. And in particular, they broke in poor working class black neighborhoods, predominantly black neighborhoods of the places like the Lower Ninth Ward, which were built on lower ground because lower ground was cheaper in this area, right? So it was more accessible financially for a lot of people. And as a working class black neighborhood was not super high up on the city government's list of like maintenance to keep up with. And so as a result of this kind of systematic institutional neglect, actually became more vulnerable to environmental catastrophe. And when Katrina hit New Orleans, it wasn't a particularly strong hurricane. However, the built resources, the city infrastructure was in such a state that even a lower level hurricane or storm would have these devastating effects. So that is a dynamic that in this example cannot be reduced to either humans or the environment. but you really have to understand the complex intersections between infrastructure, society, class, race, and climate change. So as we do this, anthropologists are increasingly deconstructing the nature-culture dichotomy, including the dichotomy between humans and animals. And we're starting to think about alternatives to this more and more. This is something that's really exciting in the context of thinking about a world shaped by climate change, because it means we're not stuck into the foundational philosophical assumptions about what it means to be human and what it means and what nature means that lead to these kinds of maladaptive systems. There is human variation there. And we look at questions of multi-species relationships, really thinking about how non-human beings as parts of our social relations, right? As thinking about social relations, instead of just arbitrarily stopping our consideration of social relationships at the human, we can actually think about non-human beings as part of those social systems as well. And that might change the way we have to think about things like culture and society, because these are terms that historically have been defined in ways to explain the ways humans are unlike other animals. For example, symbols and learned behavior. But if we're including non-human animals, do we have to change those definitions? It's an interesting set of questions. Indigenous knowledge and ontology, I'll come back to those concepts more, but we've also read them a little bit. You'll be a little familiar with them from Page West and Dispossession of the Environment. Really thinking about ways indigenous peoples encode knowledge according to fundamentally different philosophical frameworks. Or what I would call, as a specialist, ontologies. Now, if you don't remember the word ontology, the quick translation is ontology is a theory of being, but it's not a term you need to master for this class. Wait until you take advanced anthropological theory classes and you'll get deeper into it there. So the first reading, one of the readings I had y'all do is Richard Lee on Kung cultural ecology. Kung is said with a click. It's a click language. Kung people are indigenous to South Africa and live in the Kalahari Desert. And this article, it's an older one, so it's a good example of that older cultural ecology framework, how do humans adapt to the environment. But it's one that I've been thinking about since I read it 15 years ago, and I figure anything that I've found useful to think about for 15 years is worth sharing. And so the way as a society we normally think about hunter-gatherer or foraging societies is through a social evolutionist framework that views foraging as a less advanced form of adaptation compared to agriculturalism and industrialization. And there's this kind of cultural mythology or belief system that comes with those ideologies that say foraging lifestyles are nasty, brutish, and short. And it's precarious, right? And when Richard Lee quotes that idea, nasty, brutish, and short, that actually comes from a European philosopher who was theorizing. His idea was that before the rise of the state, life was nasty, brutish, and short because people were running around killing each other. And so we needed to come up with a way of keeping people from killing each other, so we invented the state to control ourselves. Now, the problem with that history is it's entirely made up. That's not what happened. It's a just so story. But that kind of idea continues to permeate our popular discourse and imagination. And when Richard Lee actually looks at Kung subsistence patterns, he finds that these ideas just simply do not hold. So he's working in the context of a multi-year drought, so pretty harsh environmental conditions in the Kalahari Desert. And in this context, the average work week for Kong people is about 19 hours over 2.5 days. And during this time, they are able to collect a subsistence. They're able to feed themselves, and that subsistence is routine and secure year round. So, one of the things I find most interesting here that really struck me is, well, holy shit, I work a lot more than 19 hours a week to feed myself. As a professor, I probably work anywhere between 40 on a good week to 60 or 70, maybe. I don't know, it depends on the week. I don't usually time it. But like, geez, I really fucked up with that like whole fucking industrialization thing. And that's, a tongue-in-cheek joke. Like, I'm not trying, I just want to clarify that I'm not trying to like say we need to all go back to a foraging society. I'm not advocating anarcho-primitivism, anarcho-primitivism. That is, if all of humans were to adopt a foraging lifestyle, we would not be able to feed ourselves. It would be pretty catastrophic and horrible, in terms of like death and starvation. It just takes a lot of land, and the population is pretty dense at Earth at this point. But it's still interesting to think about. Now, another thing that's really interesting is that the large majority of food stuff is collected by women who are gathering plants. It's actually not meat, because gathering plants, plants don't run away. This is low risk and high return food stuff. So that's the majority of people's nutrition. Whereas hunting is high risk, low return. It's easier to have unsuccessful hunts, and even when they are successful, you're just not bringing home as many calories as plants. So this really challenges a lot of cultural stereotypes we have about hunter gatherers, and like this whole narrative of man the hunter that we're told, because hunting is not really the primary form of subsistence in foraging. And I think about, for example, my mom got really into a few years back this paleo diet, and the idea was we should eat food that is more similar to what our ancestors ate, because our digestive systems haven't evolved biologically to the point where we can digest processed food as well. And so this was mostly meats. Now the problem is this is a patriarchal narrative of foraging societies, right? This ultimately meat is not what the primary form of nutrition. We also see that elders and disabled people in Kong society are cared for and valued for their ceremonial knowledge. We're seeing something really different from that the assumption that foraging is precarious, that it's nasty, brutish, and short, that people are always on the edge of starvation. We see something radically different, even in a multi-year drought in the middle of a desert. And I want to do a brief little interlude before going back to that article on Kong societies, to provide an archaeological perspective that resonates with this larger idea. So today, one thing that archaeologists are talking about is the idea of complex foraging societies. There used to be an assumption that, and this is an assumption that again comes out of social evolutionism, an assumption that foraging societies were not able to gain the population density that it would take to have things like like expansive divisions of labor, what archaeologists would call complexity, meaning like a complex social system is seen as one with lots of different forms of social differentiation. Often inequality, but not necessarily. Um, I actually hate that word complex society. It is something used in the archaeological literature, but it just like that opposition simple versus complex. We're just reeking of social evolutionist assumptions here. But, that is the literature, and we do need words to talk to one another, I guess. Um, Anywho, right, the assumption was foraging societies were not able to build systems of like different social differentiation and large public architecture. That you just couldn't do that in a foraging society. You needed agriculture to gain greater population density. And, over the past 15 years or so, archaeologists have increasingly been saying, wait, that's not actually what we see. We see a lot of different sites that really challenge this framework. And so one of these is this site, Poverty Point, which is a site in contemporary Louisiana. This site was built most of it was built about 3,500 years ago. There are parts that were built 2,000 years prior to that, and there are other parts that were built 2,000 years after that. But most of it was built in this 3,500 years ago time span. And the ridges, so the site, it's a large earthwork site. It was made by basically piling up earth to create a built landscape through baskets loads by basket load by basket load. So you have the plaza that gets leveled. You have these large earthwork ridges that are about a kilometer in length, so very long ridges, and there are 6 of them. There is circumstantial evidence to suggest that maybe people built their houses on top of those ridges, although that is circumstantial. And they built many of these mounds, right? Earthwork mounds, the largest of which is about 7 stories tall, so 70 feet tall, and it is 705 by 660 feet at the base. So that's multiple football fields of dirt piled 7 stories high. So this is a massive construction project. And the archaeological research is showing us that the site was actually built really quickly, probably within about 60 to 90 days, because we can see the different stages in the construction of these mounds, and there isn't very much erosion between those layers, which means that each one was built in rapid succession. We also see no evidence of social inequalities or permanent social statuses, meaning this was a landscape built by foraging peoples. This is prior to the adoption of agriculture. This is a landscape built by foraging peoples with a situational leadership, meaning people took on leadership roles for the sake of building this mound, right? People took on those leadership roles, but those didn't pass to their children. They didn't affect people's everyday life. They weren't considered higher up on a social inequality. They were just taking leadership on a particular project. So this is a non-hierarchical society with foraging lifestyles that is building massive, massive architecture. And so this is a really great example of the problems of those ethnocentric assumptions about foraging societies. Now here I want to circle back and talk about some of the problems in Lee's article. Because while I love this article, he also actually falls back into those social evolutionist hang-ups, and he falls back into those assumptions that he's trying to critique. So his language makes him appear really objective, right? It sounds factual, right? He's describing that Kung do this, Kung do that. He's giving us numbers, quantitative data. And he's not writing himself as a character the way other anthropologists we've read have. And all of that makes it appear like he's just giving us the facts, right? But is he really? Or is that just a writing style that obscures his underlying assumptions? What Mendoza-Denton earlier this semester called his perceptual filters that he brings into the research. And so we see things like the statement, until 10,000 years ago, everyone in the world survived by hunting and gathering wild foods. And there are these little moments throughout the article where we are encouraged to look at Kung lifestyles in the 1960s as an analogy for how humans in other time periods lived, right? This idea that because Kung people are foragers, that we can study their society to understand the foraging past in other societies. This is straight out of the social evolutionist playbook. Now, the problem is that the things that Lee is observing, the very practices that Lee observes in Kong societies, is a specific adaptation to a colonial and capitalist context. It doesn't exist outside of a larger historical and global context. Because, and we see this a little bit in the epilogue, where Lee talks about how by the 90s a lot of Kong people had shifted out of a foraging lifestyle and were increasingly adopting wage labor and pastoralist work as a result of increasing pressures from private pastoral interests who were enclosing tracts of land and making it harder and harder to do foraging. But even when he was writing, right, even when he was doing his research in the 1960s, Kong people were living the way they were as a result, as an adaptation to a larger colonial context. That includes these same economic interests and colonial interests that led to the enclosure of land as private property and the expansion of pastoral modes of subsistence, particularly for-profit pastoralism. And in response, Kong people moved into more and more marginal environments, like the Kalahari Desert, where the state and where corporate interests they didn't care about these landscapes that much. So Kong people were able to be left alone more by living there. So when we look at a 19-hour work week to feed yourself, we're looking at a 19-hour work week in the context of a multi-year drought in the middle of a desert as this particular adaptation to colonial and capitalist pressures. And it's still a 19-hour work week. But this is that key point, right? That we have to look at cultural. If cultural is adaptive, we have to look at that as an adaptation to both historical and environmental circumstances. And I gave you this other picture of Kong people, which you can compare to the above one, right? And even if you just look at this detail, right, you're going to see something really different than the picture that you might have imagined reading Lee's article. Now, granted, this is 50 years later, but still, the point remains. And then you read an article by Kyle White, who's not an anthropologist, he's a philosopher, but lovely dude, who is writing about indigenous adaptations to climate change and indigenous conservation movements. And so when he's writing about the Anthropocene, again, that means the geological era defined by human-driven climate change. And he has this lovely point where he says, oh, if as indigenous peoples, our ancestors were looking at the world today, this would be a dystopian post-apocalyptic landscape. Because look at how our relationships with our more than human kin have been disrupted and transformed. Look what's happened to our descendants. And so in popular discourse in science fiction, we often think about climate change as a future problem. We think about, or at least collapse. We think about environment-led collapse and dystopia and apocalypse as a future thing that we want to avoid, right? We want to develop policies that help us avoid environmental apocalypse. And what Kyle White is saying, and this is something that a lot of people are saying in Black studies and post-colonial studies and indigenous studies, is it's too late for that. We have been living in a post-apocalyptic world for 400 years now. And indigenous peoples have been facing these kinds of environmental transformations, these disruptive environmental transformations for, 400, 500 years now. This includes things like being forced onto reservations, which means you have a smaller territorial base, which makes it harder to adapt to climate change. It includes things like the introduction of cattle and pigs in the southeast, which led to large-scale deforestation in the region, thereby having a negative impact on deer population, which, combined with the fur trade, which further led to the overhunting of deer, makes feeding yourself less and less possible outside of participation within capitalist economies. I'll have another example later. Actually, I'm going to put off the example I was just going to give for a second. And so for Kyle White, what he's saying is apocalyptic climate change is a historical event, not a future one. And, some people, some anthropologists and geologists debate when we should start. When do we consider the Anthropocene to start? Some people say with the rise of consumer capitalism in the 1950s. Others say with the rise of capitalism, industrial capitalism in the 1800s. There's also an argument being forwarded by many indigenous anthropologists and indigenous and non-indigenous geologists that focus on the Obrus spike of 1610. So, the Obrus spike is a phenomenon we see in the geological strata of the Earth. And what it is actually, it's a decrease in carbon dioxide levels. It's a sharp decrease. And it's interesting, right? Because when we think about climate change, we usually think about carbon dioxide levels increasing atmospherically. But this is a sharp decrease that then is followed by a steady increase for the next 400 years. And what causes this? Well, one theory is that the Obrus spike is essentially caused by the mass dying of human and non-human beings as a result of European expansion. Things like the spread of new diseases, invasive species, other kinds of environmental transformations, et cetera, right? And I mean, when we talk about disease, like there's different death rates or statistics for how catastrophic such diseases were for indigenous peoples, but they're above 90%. We're talking about 90 to 99. Some figures go as high as 99% mortality rates. Now, that's not all at once. That's a population drop between 1491 and today, or maybe not today, but in the 1900s. But it is quite catastrophic. And so the Obrus spike is often thought, or one way of thinking about the Obrus spike is it is a decrease in carbon dioxide levels as a result of mass dying, as a result of less and less organisms exhaling carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so that level of mass death has been physically marked into the geological strata of the Earth at this point. And so one of the things Kyle White talks about, and I've talked with some of you about this earlier in the semester, is, for example, we look at these images of starving polar bears that spread across popular media in recent years. And Kyle White kind of makes the point of like, oh, hey, this is actually a very culturally specific understanding of the environment, where we are supposed to relate to polar bears and have empathy for polar bears as a species that we don't encounter in our everyday lives. So we're supposed to understand climate change in terms of these images of things like polar bears that we ultimately have no direct connection to, right? We imagine it as affecting other organisms out there somewhere far away from us. Whereas indigenous conservation efforts are not based on the idea of saving species or saving multi-diversity necessarily. It's rather about conserving particular animal and plant species that are culturally significant. It's about conserving culturally significant relationships that are based in particular geographical places, in particular ecologies. It's not about polar bears unless you live in a world where polar bears are an important relation. It might be something else, like certain tree or plant species. And so, in that context, right, there's not this kind of separation between cultural revitalization and environmental conservationism, right? It's actually just two sides of the same coin. And it is very much based in the privileging of direct first-hand relationships, as opposed to abstract ideas of nature as something out there in the world somewhere else. I have another example of thinking about colonialism and the environment, which is the spread of forest fires. Now, one thing we think about, like even the idea of the Anthropocene, the idea of a human-driven era of climate change, we're not talking about humans. This is not human caused. This is caused by specific social systems, not humans in general. And it's caused by some humans much more than others. Indigenous peoples largely are not responsible, are not the ones driving climate change. Now, of course, there are lots of indigenous corporations that do a lot of horrible things, or indigenous peoples, indigenous CEOs leading corporations that do horrible things to the environment. I'm not saying that. But rather, at this point, we're looking at a social system, a way of feeding ourselves. We're looking at the unintended effects of industrial capitalism and colonialism. And so, forest fires. Forest fires spreading across California are new, or they're increasing. They're not new, but the rate is increasing in catastrophic ways. And part of the issue is a result of changing forestry practices in the region. So indigenous peoples historically had really complicated systems of forest environmental management, including doing things like controlled burns, which were really important in these particular ecologies out west. They're also important out east. People did controlled burns here too. And so when Europeans arrived, they assumed the environment they were looking at was a pristine natural landscape, and they marveled at how lush and how bountiful the earth was here in this place. What they didn't realize was that it was bountiful and lush because of indigenous forestry practices, that was something that took work to maintain and create. And so in the 1900s, 18 and 1900s, U.S. business interests looked at these old growth forests and said, wow, look at all that timber. We can cut down these big ass trees and make a lot of money. And the idea was trees are a renewable resource, right? You cut up the trees, new ones grow. And so environmental management at this era was geared towards promoting the interests of timber industries and creating renewable and letting those forests regrow after being cut down. And the assumption was they would regrow in the same way. However, by this point, indigenous peoples are restricted to reservation contexts and no longer practicing widespread forest management. The park services of the U.S. government is adopting a fundamentally different set of forestry management practices based on the cultural assumption that these are pristine environments that are best maintained by keeping humans out of them. Nature means the absence of humans within this cultural system, and so conservation involves reducing human intervention, other than logging, of course, because we love logging. There's an exception for everything. And that was a fundamental misunderstanding of these ecologies, in which humans actually were integral players. And so the forests that grew up actually were different forests. There were different trees that started growing, trees that were better adapted to disturbed ecological contexts. And the forest, the range of different tree species shifted, and a lot of those old growth trees became narrower and narrower in their ecological span. And the new trees were um, actually more prone to forest fires. Then, you have the buildup of debris on the ground because that's not being taken care of, and that becomes a fire hazard. And so, as a result of these changes, the forest is just radically different. The forest ecology is just a different one than existed 400 years ago. And this new ecology, combined with drier and hotter climates, is far more prone to devastating wildfires. And so in this context, right, like we're looking at climate change, it's not just humans driving it. This is a particular set of colonial environmental transformations that produce new environmental conditions that put us where we are now. So this poses a lot of really interesting questions, right? Because what we're dealing with here is, wow, the idea of the human itself is a social construct. The idea of nature is a social construct. The idea of an animal is a social construct. Oh shit. So now we're starting to think about social relations as including non-human beings. We're thinking about social systems as including human and non-human processes, and that relationship between environmental processes and human infrastructure and human practice is actually deeply, deeply entangled and fundamentally really inseparable, right? We can separate them conceptually with words like nature and humans, but that doesn't actually help us explain what's going on very well. We start to see the animal as a symbolic resource, right? So what does the representation of starving polar bears do as a cultural symbol? Um, and there's many other kinds of examples. We'll have another example of this with fat pets, right? What is the symbol of a fat pet, which you'll read an article about later. What does that do as a symbolic construction? And here, what we see is the way we construct the animal and the way we construct the human, these are two sides of the same coin. What it means to be human is something we approach through our relationships with non-humans. Non-humans are integral to what it means to be human. We can also ask who is considered fully human and who is excluded from that category. Who is considered or represented to be more animal-like? Because indeed, you can look historically at the history of racist stereotypes or anti-Semitic stereotypes, and a common trope is to represent human beings as more animal-like, as having a hawk-like nose, for example, or being more similar to a non-human primate, as a way of rhetorically or symbolically dehumanizing them. So again, animals are super important in our social systems, even our symbolic systems. They are integrally tied to things like our social inequalities in the societies we live in, as well as what it means to be human. Now, from a biological anthropological perspective, this is really interesting because biologically, Homo sapiens sapiens is a species of greater apes. We are greater apes. That distinction between humans and animals doesn't really, it gets weird at this point, right? So how can we simultaneously understand that we are animals, that we are a species of greater apes, and also believe that we are somehow different or outside of nature, that humans are outside of nature and nature is space without humans? So this kind of contradiction really helps illustrate that contradictory nature of that assumption that nature is a space removed of humans and vice versa. Um, Although it's also a very important, this contradiction itself is symbolically a important part of how humans have historically been imagined, right? Like we imagine the state, for example, as a mechanism of policing our animal nature. Again, in this kind of social evolutionist frame, that we have an inherent animal nature that needs to be repressed and civilized. Um, that there is something more primitive in us that has to be repressed and civilized. This is a social evolutionist framing. But anyway, right, there's this kind of idea that human beings are simultaneously rational and animal. And so our animal sides have to be policed and managed and punished through state power, often totalitarian state power. I mean, you know, even when it comes to like public health, right? Public health is about managing human populations as biological organisms in rational ways. So what all of these contradictions point to is this problem, what I would call human exceptionalism. Human exceptionalism is the idea that humans are somehow exceptional from the rest of the species, that there is something fundamentally different about us. And that is the concept that is today seeming less and less and less coherent as an analytical category. And increasingly, people are thinking about how do we blur the lines of this kind of dichotomy. And one kind of example of this, if you want to look into it further, is this idea of the multi-species salon. This is an art project that was developed by, in kind of parallel to a bunch of anthropological research. They've actually had exhibitions at anthropological conferences. And it's this kind of it's an artistic project that is about exploring hybridization kinds of bodies, or imagining hybrid bodies that of human and animal, and thinking about moving through the world in ways that challenge our ideas of that distinction between human and animal. So if you want to look at it more, I'll put the link in the description. So in short, right, the anthropology of humans and the environment has historically focused on culture as an adaptive mechanism to different kinds of environmental contexts, and understanding the diversity of ways that humans relate to the environment and feed themselves, make a subsistence on that environment. However, contemporary research looks at adaptation to both historical and environmental circumstances, and increasingly challenges the idea of human exceptionalism to better understand, or to really ask, how can we better understand? Because we're still trying to figure that out. How do we understand a world in which this division between humans and nature, human and animal, is breaking down?